Top 10 battles and strategies of the Civil War. Number 10. The Battle of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta was fought on July 22nd in Georgia, just outside of the city of Atlanta. The Union forces were under the command of Major General William T. Sherman and were 34,000 strong, while the Confederates were under the command of General John Bell Hood and had 40,000 troops. The Battle of Atlanta was part of the Atlanta Campaign by Sherman to neutralize the city as an important supply and rail center of the Confederate Army. The battle led the Union to a victory with only 3,600 casualties, while the Confederates suffered 8,500. 2 months following Sherman's victory, the siege of Atlanta was completed and Sherman burned down most of the city to crush Southern morale. After this, Sherman's March to sea began and Northern morale was greatly increased, helping Lincoln to win the re-election. Since I live in Georgia, this had to make the list. Number 9. Fort Sumter. The Battle of Fort Sumter took place between April 12th and April 13th in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Battle of Fort Sumter was the first battle of the American Civil War, taking place almost 4 months after South Carolina had seceded from the Union. Prior to the battle, the fort had been under siege since December 26th, as Union Commander Major Robert Anderson moved his troops from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter, which defied the negotiations that South Carolina Governor Francis Pickens was attempting to hold with Washington about the occupied forts in his state. By April 12th, after months of failed negotiations and surrender talks, the Confederates decided to fire on the fort, following the news that President Abraham Lincoln was going to mount a relief expedition to bring supplies to Fort Sumter. It was shortly after the Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard told Anderson that firing on the fort would start at 4:30 a.m., after the final failed surrender talks, with it being said that Edmund Ruffin fired the first shot. At 7 a.m., the Union forces fired their first return shot in the war, done by Captain Abner Doubleday. On April 13th, Lewis Wigfall, without the approval of Beauregard, rode out to the fort and negotiated a surrender. Following further official negotiations by Beauregard, it was agreed the official surrender would take place on April 14th at midday. Since there were no casualties in the battle, this had to be ranked number 9. Number 8. The Siege of Vicksburg. The Siege of Vicksburg took place between May 18th and July 4th in Warren County, Mississippi, near the city of Vicksburg. The Union Army was commanded by Major General Ulysses S. Grant and was 75,000 men strong, while the Confederate Army was commanded by Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton and was 34,000 men strong. Prior to the siege, Union and Confederate forces had clashed for the prior week during Grant's inland campaign in Mississippi. Grant decided to try and quickly take Vicksburg on the 18th of May, but had successive assaults badly repelled in a span of 4 days due to the strong defensive works around the city. This led Grant to siege the city and cut it off from being resupplied. After almost 2 months of being shelled from all sides and being out of food for the soldiers and civilians, Pemberton surrendered to Grant with the condition that all his men would be paroled. Despite the long siege, the Confederates only suffered 3,300 casualties, while the Union had suffered 4,800. The aftermath of the battle led to the Confederacy losing control of the Mississippi River and Mississippi, and helped to cement Grant's reputation that would eventually lead him to command the whole Union Army. This battle is where Ulysses S. Grant made a name for himself, which is why it is placed at number 8 on the list. Number 7. Battle of Appomattox Station and Courthouse. The Battle of Appomattox Station and Courthouse took place on April 9th and was one of the final battles of the American Civil War. The Union Army, led by Grant, was 120,000 men strong, completely outnumbering Lee's Confederate Army of only 30,000. 2 days before the battle, Lee had received a letter from Grant requesting his surrender, but he refused. Lee was hopeful that his men could not get to Lynchburg while fending off Union cavalry before any infantry showed up. After early fighting, Lee received reports of the Union infantry and decided to surrender to Grant since there was no reason to keep retreating. After correspondence, Lee and Grant met to discuss the surrender terms shortly after midday, effectively, but not officially ending the American Civil War. The casualties on both sides of this battle were light, with 260 Union casualties and 440 Confederate. This battle ended the war, which is why it's number 7 on the list. Number 6. The First Battle of Bull Run. The first Battle of Bull Run took place on July 21st in Fairfax County and Prince William County near the city of Manassas, Virginia. The battle was one of the first to take place during the war and is the most well known early battle due to the fact that it was the first major land based confrontation. The Union forces, under Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, were 28,400 strong, while the Confederate forces under Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston were 30,800 strong. Going into the battle, Union forces had high hopes of routing the rebels and putting a quick end to the war. This battle went back and forth between the Confederates and Union troops until Johnston's reinforcements arrived. This led to the rout of the Union Army, a major Confederate victory, and dashed Northern hopes of the war coming to a quick conclusion. The battle resulted in 2,700 Union casualties and 2,200 Confederate casualties. The fact that this is the first battle makes it 10 times better than the Second Battle of Bull Run, which is why it is number 6 on the list. Number 5. The Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan was a military strategy proposed by Union General Winfield Scott early in the American Civil War. The plan called for a naval blockade of the Confederate littoral, thrust down the Mississippi, and the strangulation of the South by Union land and naval forces. Number 4. The Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam took place on September 17th in Washington County by the city of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Union forces were under the command of Major General George B. McClellan, who had been given command following the Second Bull Run, and were 300,000 men strong. The Confederate forces, under the command of Robert E. Lee, numbered only 52,000 soldiers. The Battle of Antietam was the major battle of Lee's Maryland campaign, which was undertaken due to Lee's increased confidence to take pressure off of the Shenandoah Valley at harvest time, to demoralize Northerners and to encourage European support for the Confederacy. The one-day battle between Lee and McClellan will result in the bloodiest single-day battle in the Civil War in all of American history. When the fighting was done, a total of 12,400 Union and 10,300 Confederate soldiers were dead. Despite the battle being a stalemate, the Union technically won due to the fact that they stopped Lee's northern invasion. In the aftermath of the battle, McClellan was replaced as head of the Army of the Potomac by Ambrose Burnside, due to his failure to pursue Lee's retreating forces. President Abraham Lincoln also used the repealing of Lee's forces as the justification for announcing the Emancipation Proclamation and basically ended any chance of the European support for the Confederates. Number 3. High ground. As we know from Star Wars 3 and from Fortnite, high ground always wins. Although you couldn't build or have super jumps just like in Fortnite and Star Wars, soldiers had to go to natural high grounds, such as hills. High ground was easier to shoot from, being as gravity goes down and not up. You also had a better viewing angle from up on top than on the ground. For instance, if I had cover on the top, it would be almost impossible to get me with the guns they used back then. But if I was hiding under a rock, 50 feet below where the other side was, my entire body would be exposed. Number 2. The Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought between July 1st and 3rd in Adams County, Pennsylvania, near the town of Gettysburg. The Union Army was commanded by Major General George C.G. Meade and was 82,289 men strong, while the Confederate Army was commanded by Robert E. Lee and was 75,000 men strong. The Battle of Gettysburg was the culmination of Lee's Gettysburg campaign in order to try and obtain badly needed supplies, undermine Northern morale, and encourage anti-war action in the North. What resulted from this campaign, however, was the largest and deadliest battle of the American Civil War, with 23,049 Union casualties and 28,063 Confederate casualties. Following his defeat, Lee retreated back to Virginia with his army, but would never invade the North again, and would be pushed back towards Richmond for the remainder of the war. The aftermath of Gettysburg was the turning point in the war, as the loss of the battle, along with the Confederate surrender at Vicksburg the following day, is seen as a turning point in the war that would lead to the victory by the Union. Months after the battle, Lincoln would deliver his Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, one of the best-known speeches in American history. Number 1. Sherman's March to Sea. From November 15th until December 21st, 1864, Union General William T. Sherman led some 60,000 soldiers on a 285-mile march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. The purpose of Sherman's march was to frighten Georgians' civilian population into abandoning the Confederate cause. Sherman's soldiers did not destroy any of the towns in their path, but they stole food and livestock and burned the houses and barns of people who tried to fight back. The Yankees were not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, Sherman explained. As a result, they needed to make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. This march devastated Georgia and Sherman gave this to Lincoln as a present. This really signified the end of the war and how the South could not come back after this. Thank you.